If you think that Eastern luxury is all about flying carpets, genies, and tea in bowls under minarets, then you probably haven't been there. In Bukhara, under the Emir, life was more serious. Gold clinked in chests, not fairy tales, and sorrow filled both our minds and palace halls. The Emir was not just a ruler, but something between a sultan, a chief executive officer, and God's representative on earth. He decided who would live, who would enter the harem, and who would disappear from the list of the living altogether. The Bukhara Emirs lived lavishly, but, as usual, left this world sadly, leaving behind legends and treasures that treasure hunters are still searching for. In this episode, I'll tell you exactly how they lived, who gave them foot massages, and why one of them needed a mechanical woman. I'm Semyon, opening the How to Live At section. Let's start. How did the Bukhara Emirs appear, the Bukhara ones? To understand where the Bukhara Emirs came from, you don't need to dig too deep. It's enough to know that Central Asia in the 18th century was like a good place for fishing. Everyone wanted to cast their fishing rod and pull out a piece of power for themselves. It was on these turbulent waters in 1753 that the Bukhara Emirate emerged. Its founders were representatives of the Uzbek Manghit dynasty, who, riding the wave of political anarchy, skillfully ousted the old Khans and declared themselves Emirs. How did the Bukhara Emirs come to be? How did the Bukhara Emirs appear? How did the Bukhara Emirs come to be? How did the Bukhara Emirs appear? How did the Bukhara Emirs come to be? How did the Bukhara Emirs appear? How did the Bukhara Emirs come to be? How did the Bukhara Emirs appear? The Bukhara Emirs. How did the Bukhara Emirs come to be? How did the Bukhara Emirs appear? How did the Bukhara Emirs come to be? How did the Bukhara Emirs appear? How did the Bukhara Emirs come to be? The world and everything that happened in the country depended on his appetite, both in the literal and political sense. It's especially interesting that by the 19th century, the Bukhara Emirate found itself in a rather convenient position. It became a vassal of the Russian Empire, meaning it was seemingly independent, but it only took someone to sneeze for that to change. A cold was already starting in both St. Petersburg and Bukhara. The emirs regularly received gifts from the czars, and in return they promised to behave and not cause any trouble. In general, the Bukhara Emir was an Eastern autocrat in a luxurious hat, with an unlimited harem and a slight dependence on the northern ruler. The story of his rise is about how a lucky ruler happened to be in the right step at the right time. How much money and how many palaces they had, even though tilia tangas and fulus coins jingled in the bazaars of Bukhara. All the really important figures, income, bribes, budgets, were given in rubles. Why? It's simple. As I mentioned, since the late 19th century, the Emirate of Bukhara became a vassal of the Russian Empire. If you wanted to be understood in St. Petersburg, it was best to speak Russian and use rubles. The Russian Mission and Brockhaus Encyclopedia report the emir's yearly income was 5 to 7 million rubles. The emir received income from all sides: taxes from craftsmen, duties from merchants, tribute from subordinate tribes, and fines from those who displeased him. Everything that could be taxed was taxed, from camels to marriage contracts. And if the revenues suddenly dried up, it was always possible to send the army, pacify the neighbors, and bring home not only submission, but also a couple hundred captives, some gold, and rare fabrics. But let's get back to the budget. 5 to 7 million rubles roughly matched the budget of a city emirate on the level of Kiev in the early 20th century, except instead of a municipal water supply, he had a harem with its own floor for concubines. The emir governed a country on a budget similar to a large Russian empire city, managing everything alone without a council, parliament, or opposition. To give you an idea of the scale, with that amount of money, you could build a railway roughly from Bukhara to Samarkand and back, or maintain an army of 10,000 men on a salary, and there would still be enough left for a harem, or to educate 20,000 students at the Imperial University, or to build 25 luxurious palaces each with a unique interior. Now imagine that this is just the annual budget, because by the time the last emir, Said Alim Khan, fled, he supposedly took treasures worth 150 million rubles with him. Soviet sources claimed that he had up to 10 tons of gold, some of which is still being sought by treasure hunters. A legend is one thing, but a treasure measured in elephants is already almost mythology. Where was all of this kept? Of course, in palaces. The main residence, the Ark of Bukhara citadel in the very center of the city, is not just a building, but a mini-state. A throne room, treasury, harem, private mosque, prison and gardens, as well as massive walls. Even the most brilliant emir sometimes had to defend himself from both enemies and unhappy townspeople. For the summer, the emir moved to Sitarai Makikosa, the palace like the moon, where it was cool, fashionable and luxuriously European. Mirrors, stained glass, crystal chandeliers, and sofas that were clearly not locally made. In Bukhara, European architects and Eastern luxury met at one point and gave birth to a dream palace, where one could hide from the heat, dust, and responsibility. There were also residences in Samarkand, Karshi, Shakri, and Sabze, each with gardens, fountains, caravanserais, and private harems. At the exit, sometimes it seemed that the emir simply traveled between palaces so he wouldn't get bored of the interiors, but that wasn't all. The Bukhara emirs had palaces outside the Emirate, at their northern summer residences, so to speak, in Yalta. The Yalta Palace of the Emir of Bukhara, where they relaxed in the sea breeze like true Russian aristocrats. In Zheleznovodsk, the Zheleznovodsk Palace was a resort oasis among mineral springs and imperial generals. In St. Petersburg, the Emir of Bukhara's house served as an architectural greeting from Bukhara in the empire's heart. And in Orenburg, the Emir's official representation could also be seen as a residence, in case it was necessary to handle matters with the royal court or urgently buy another grand piano. So when someone said rich as an emir, it wasn't an exaggeration. It was an economic unit of measurement applied in architecture, finance, and landscape design. Wives, concubines, and palace intrigues. The Emir of Bukhara was not just the head of state, he was also the chief keeper of the harem, and according to all the rules of Sharia, well, almost officially, Islam allowed him to have up to 4 wives, but this only applied to legal marriages with Muslim women. But when it came to concubines, the only limits were the square footage of the palace and the endurance of the eunuchs. Concubines were free girls from Bukhara and the surrounding areas who were invited to the harem by senior eunuchs with the knowledge of their parents. Female captives taken during military campaigns were simply bought at slave markets after a medical screening for health and appearance. And sometimes girls from far away were exotic and expensive, like silk from Kashgar. Entering the harem at 13 was seen as the start of a successful career. The chief eunuch and the emir's close associates personally selected the girls, then made arrangements with their families, because refusing was like stepping on the emir's robe in the mosque. Getting into the harem was considered an honor, especially if it was a girl from a respected family. Yes, there was as much freedom there as in a jug, but in return there was food, cosmetics, servants, jewelry, and the chance to bear an heir for a poor family. Giving your daughter to the harem was like hitting the jackpot. One child in the palace and the whole family was almost aristocrats. The harem was divided by rank. Wives lived downstairs, concubines upstairs. Each had her own servants. They weren't allowed to get bored. Cosmetics, self-care, dancing, poetry, music, and there were special requirements for musicians and teachers. Blindness was welcomed as it eliminated unnecessary eye contact. They could only walk in the palace garden, and even then only with the permission of the main woman of the harem, the emir's mother. She would sit and scheme and hold investigations just like the spirits in Turkish television series. A woman could only leave the palace wearing a hijab and with her face covered, not just with fabric, but with a veil made of horsehair, because obviously an ordinary veil couldn't handle the Eastern temperament. And if a man of another faith happened to be coming their way, all the women would turn away, hide their heads in the nearest bush or alcove, or simply pretend to be vases. But this is also important. The women in the harem took great care of themselves, like in top salons, using black kohl on their lashes and lids, and styling their eyebrows into a fashionable, erotic unibrow. Care for the body, skin, teeth, and nails. To always be ready. Even if the emir remembered you only once a year, and if he didn't remember, you could become a retired wife. By the way, that's not a disgrace, but a form of promotion. The emir often married his former wives and concubines to officials as a reward. It was a promotion, a prestigious job, as they say, though there was some excesses. One of the emirs, Muzaffar for example, was seriously interested in a mechanical woman, one who wouldn't age, wouldn't argue, wouldn't ask for gifts, and would always be satisfied. Court jesters brought him rumors about such a high-tech concubine, saying that Russian czars supposedly had one, like a samovar, but with eyes. Muzaffar believed it, and even tried to order one from Petersburg. That's Bukharan-style cyberfeminism for you. How did the people feel about the emir? If they conducted surveys in Bukhara, the question would be, how do you feel about the emir? It would sound like, are you for his health or his execution? In the official chronicles, of course, the people loved and respected the emir. But in the alleys of the old city, they whispered jokes where the emir always had either greed, constipation, or some kind of problem. In the harem, craftsmen and merchants, the backbone of the city's economy, treated the emir like a natural disaster with a tax function. On one hand, there was order, caravans were protected, bazaars thrived, and no one dared to encroach on your territory. On the other hand, every product went through a duty, a fee, a tax surcharge, and, of course, a little gift to the palace splendor fund. Religious authorities, ulamas, and imams supported the emir, but only if he didn't meddle in theology. There were cases when the emir sentenced one of the scholars to execution, accusing them of heresy, and in turn, they accused him of taxation, not according to the Quran. People sometimes showed their dissatisfaction subtly but firmly. Even the wealthiest vizier could be refused entry to the mosque, signaling he was unwelcome among his own peasants. Naturally, they never saw the emir, only the tax collectors, and even those just once a year, but to them, the emir was more like a force of nature. He was somewhere out there in the palace, in the gardens, in silks, and definitely not interested in how their harvest was going. Interestingly, people in Bukhara had mixed feelings about wealth. Mashallah, he lives so beautifully, if only we could do the same, but that's just not reality. So much gold without sin. People believed in karma in an Eastern way. If you have so many concubines, it means in your next life you'll be a dog or a tax official. Another interesting point is that Emirate Bukhara's architecture reflected attitudes toward power. Large buildings had high thresholds, requiring even the emir to bow slightly when entering, symbolizing humility. Even when building a mosque near the palace, they ensured the harem windows kept their panoramic view. That's what you could call wise architectural democracy. There was also a whole genre of folk Sufi parables, where the ruling world was always foolish but rich and the main character was poor but wise. And if the story ended with Emir asking the beggar for advice, the audience was pleased, especially if the parable was told over tea and away from the guards. In short, the people of Bukhara knew how to live alongside absolute power, not to love it too much, not to criticize it too much, to know how to joke, and to be sure to keep a couple of proverbs for a rainy day, for collapse and disappearance. Every Eastern fairy tale ends someday, but in the case of the Emirate of Bukhara, it was no longer a fairy tale, but a revolutionary chronicle with elements of tragicomedy. In 1920, the Red Army approached Bukhara not with carpets, but with armored trains. The old order collapsed to the sounds of artillery fire, and all that remained of the harem with its mirrored halls was dust, Persian cushions, and one very bewildered emir. The last ruler was Said Alim Khan, the grandson of Muzaffar, the very one who believed in mechanical women. He was caught between two eras, the Jadids, Muslim reformers pushing for change and education, and the Bolsheviks, offering revolution and force. The emir tried to sit on both chairs, sometimes flirting with modernization, then rolling back to the old ways. But it turned out you couldn't maneuver between mosques and armored trains for long. When the Bukhara fortress was about to fall, Said Alim Khan fled to Afghanistan with several children, some of his harem, and reportedly a large amount of gold. According to the most daring legends, he took up to 10 tons of valuables with him and hid some of them along the way, turning every oasis into a potential treasure trove. The remaining women, palace servants, and close associates became unwanted. Many scattered across Asia, while some stayed in Bukhara as former court members. And so, one of the brightest and at the same time most archaic features of the Eastern dynasty disappeared. The Emir spent his remaining days in poverty, nearly blind and haunted by memories of past luxury. His palace in Yalta was liquidated, the office in Orenburg was closed, the servants scattered, and the greatest blow to the Emir was his son's betrayal. Shah Murat changed his last name and joined the Red Army. So, while the father was nostalgic for harems and tubetaikas, the son marched with the red banner and sang the Internationale. The Bukharan emirs ruled with absolute power, surrounded by harems, servants, gold, and the illusion that it would last forever, but history does not recognize eternity. Different times brought new songs and ideologies. And yet from that era, not only dust in the archives and strange antique villas in Yalta and St. Petersburg remain. What remains is the memory of how wealth does not save from revolution, how power without connection to reality leads to downfall, and how even the most luxurious harem does not guarantee a happy old age. And the worlds disappeared, but the questions remained. Well, that's all from me. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye, everyone.